Today I'm going to model the TiPCASTT method of annotation. The first step for that is to examine the title and any inferences you can make from it. So I see it's first frost, and when I think of first frost, I think the first snow of the year. I also notice that it's alliterative. Now I want to look at those words individually, see if there's any other associations I can make. First, is that maybe like a new experience? So the speaker or the subject is innocent or inexperienced. And frost, it's interesting that, frost obviously is something that's cold, but a frost is a really small bit of cold. It's not debilitating, it's not a blizzard, and that sort of slightly upbeat idea is maybe even underscored through the alliteration. The next thing I want to do is go through and paraphrase each of the sections of the poem. Now, I can see that the poem is laid out into 5 stanzas, and what I want to ensure is that when I paraphrase, I'm paraphrasing full ideas. So I have to look, is there just one idea or multiple ideas per stanza? The first stanza is pretty easy. It's a description of a girl in a telephone booth, and she's cold and crying. The second one is also pretty straightforward. She's trying to warm her hands. The next one, also I believe straightforward. She has to walk home alone. Fourth one is a bit strange. I'm not entirely sure what it means, but I noticed that the title is mentioned. But it seems to be about even the conversation she had. The last one speaks about the beginning of winter, but after looking at the line, the first frost of telephone phrases, I wonder, is it just the beginning of winter, or is it also the beginning of her winter, of the winter of being hurt, something sort of dying in her heart? Now, the next step is to identify the connotations of key words and any of the figurative language that goes with it. But the first stanza is entirely descriptive and seems literal, but let's take a look at those connotations. So the first one that I notice for me is this word freezing. And it's pretty extreme, particularly considering that it's just meant to be the first frost, not something strong. So freezing is really debilitating cold. I also notice that it's in the present continual tense, which means that it's currently happening. Other key words that stick out from the stanza include huddled, flimsy, stained, and smeared. None of these terms are particularly positive. Flimsy, as in flimsy coat, means that it's fragile or thin. It's not going to protect her. If she's huddled, that means she's trying to protect herself with her body, possibly because the coat itself is unable to do it. But definitely being huddled means that you're under attack, either physically or emotionally, and you're trying to be defensive. When I look at words like stained and smeared, those are rather interesting. I think smeared is pretty clear. It's a visual description of what's happened to the lipstick. But stained is much more permanent. And when I look at that, her face is stained by tears. Well, tears aren't permanent. They go away. So the idea of calling them stained increases the emotional intensity of this moment. And maybe it's permanent because of the pain. Some other full phrases that are interesting. I think we look at words like thin little fingers. Both thin and little indicate that they're small, or in this case, I think fragile, and notice that repetition. In fact, later it uses that simile, fingers like glass, or like ice. And that indicates to me that indeed her fingers are cold, but also they are indeed fragile. Directly after that, we realize that the ice or the cold isn't just on her fingers or possibly even her heart, but it's in her hair as well. And that happens because of that metaphor, glass beads. While it could literally be actual beads in her hair, that doesn't make much sense to me. It's more logical to assume that these are pieces of ice in her hair. I see that she has to beat her way back down alone the icy street. So the words that stick out for me are beat and alone. And alone's interesting because it relates back to this idea of being defensive or vulnerable in a sense, and matches this pattern I've seen in other words. Beat is rather strange. Beat is an active, aggressive term. And if she's beating her way back, and what they mean literally is that she's walking her way back, then perhaps it's not just that she's hurt, but she's also angry. We have this idea of first frost, which seems pretty clear, pretty straightforward to me. But then I look at the next line, the first frost of telephone phrases. Phrases themselves can't cause frost literally, so this is a metaphor. And I think then this idea of cold, this idea of first frost, is being used metaphorically. It means cold in the heart. And that's caused by pain. But also when I think of a cold heart, it means that someone who can't feel, and in this case maybe choosing not to feel, that in fact she's trying to defend herself. My supposition is confirmed in the next stanza where we see the metaphor continue. And here it's much clearer. Rather than the ambiguous telephone phrases, they actually say of having been hurt. Gosh, but now that makes me start to wonder, where else has the idea of being cold actually not meant cold, but actually meant emotional pain and eventually trying not to feel anything? Well, there's the line right above. It's the start of winter glittering on her cheek. And while that could literally be snowflakes, it could also be that this pain is somehow changed her, and maybe it's even permanent. And that makes me think of some other time when I used the word permanent, because of that word stained. Looking back at the other references to cold, that she's freezing and her coat is flimsy and her fingers are like ice, I think more and more that these are being used metaphorically. Just a frost won't freeze you, nor will it make your fingers like ice. It's just a little bit cold. So this idea of freezing must be emotional. The next step is to examine the speaker and the speaker's attitude towards the subject, the tone. Well, it's clear that the speaker is some sort of an observer. And that's because this first stanza is very descriptive. In fact, we see that he or she is able to describe what happens in the telephone booth, her actions against being cold, but also the idea that she's leaving. And even though there are additional phrases down here that relate directly to the girl, telephone phrases and winter glittering on her cheek, I get these are much more general. They're much more universal, the idea that all of us have been hurt. This makes me think that on the one hand, the speaker is sympathetic, and that's due to the level of detail that the speaker has in describing the girl that we see both in the first and the second stanza as well. But I also wonder, he's referring to it as a first frost. When I think of frost, I obviously think of winter, and winter is part of a cycle. Certainly it's cold and many things die, but the good thing about it is that things are reborn in spring, and it follows that cycle of spring, summer, fall, but then again back to winter. So perhaps this idea of being hurt is something that's inevitable. In fact, he calls it the first frost, which means if it's the first one, then there will be many others, which means that it is inevitable. So perhaps rather than simply being sympathetic, he's also feeling resigned, meaning he realizes it will happen. Now we want to look at the shifts. There's 5 stanzas, and each stanza has an end stop, which means that it completes the idea. But there aren't really shifts every single stanza. Indeed, this first stanza is longer and it's physical description. This second stanza is much more metaphorical, but it's still describing her in the telephone booth. So I think the shift happens after the second stanza. Now, this third stanza continues to describe her, but it's describing her outside of the telephone booth. And that's different than when the speaker returns back to this general description. And then finally, I think the final 2 stanzas are working together. And as you can see from these shifts, we're moving really from the descriptive here and her reaction to it to much more of the metaphorical and general. So from the descriptive and specific down to the universal and figurative. Now I go back to the title, and it's pretty clear that it's not just about snow, it's not just about winter, but it's really the winter in our hearts. So instead of it being first frost, I get the feeling that it's first pain or first sense of loss. Looking at everything that I've put here, I think I'm ready to decide upon a theme, essentially the message that the poem is trying to tell us. What I see is that we have a girl who was hoping to meet someone. I'm going to assume a boyfriend or a girlfriend of some sort because she was wearing lipstick. But instead, that person calls her in the telephone booth and possibly breaks up with her, which is upsetting and leaves her angry and cold. Then down here, we learn that, you know what, this is sort of universal. And in fact, it's going to happen quite a bit because this is just the first one. And also, frost and winter is part of a cycle. So maybe the theme is along those lines. Maybe it's the first feeling of loss is painful, but inevitable. And in fact, perhaps it's even natural. Now, as a reader, I'm reading this, and I realize it's not just about this one girl, but it makes me think of my own suffering, my own times which I've been in pain or I felt a sense of loss. And perhaps by reading this poem and seeing that it's universal, and also that it's natural and part of a cycle, I can take some comfort in that any time in the future when I feel pain or loss, that eventually that pain will go away.